Please." The billionaire's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I'll pay you." The words hung awkwardly in the chilled autumn air outside Chicago's Drake Hotel. $100,000, she said, swallowing hard. "Just, please take the money and walk away." Every conversation around the valet entrance stopped. Valet froze with the door of a black Range Rover still open. A couple waiting for their Uber turned to stare. Even the doorman looked confused. Standing opposite the elegantly dressed billionaire was a man whose winter coat had been stitched at the elbow more than once. His shoes were clean, but clearly worn. A little girl no older than 6 clung tightly to his hand, hiding behind his leg as strangers began watching. The man looked down at the envelope of cash in the woman's trembling hand before quietly shaking his head. "No." The billionaire blinked. "What?" I said. "No. You don't understand." "No," the man replied softly. "I understand perfectly." His daughter tugged gently on his sleeve. "Daddy." He squeezed her tiny hand reassuringly, without taking his eyes off the woman. "I don't want your money." The billionaire's breathing became uneven. "You have to leave." "I can't. You don't even know who I am." "I know enough." The crowd exchanged curious glances. Who refuses $100,000? The billionaire looked as though she might burst into tears. Then her eyes drifted toward the folded piece of paper sticking halfway out of the man's coat pocket. She reached for it instinctively. "I'm sorry." Before he could stop her, she unfolded the letter. She only read 4 lines. Her entire face changed. "Oh." Her hand began shaking. "Oh my God." If you've ever believed that kindness can change someone's entire life, take 2 seconds to like this video. It genuinely helps YouTube share stories like this with more people. And before we continue, tell us in the comments, even without knowing the context, would you have taken the money or walked away? Now, let's go back to where this incredible story really began. 3 days earlier, Monday, 7:12 a.m., Southside Chicago. The alarm had already gone off twice before Darius Cole finally opened his eyes. Not because he wanted to. Because someone tiny had climbed into bed beside him. "Daddy," a sleepy little voice whispered, "the pancakes are burning." Darius laughed before his eyes were even open. "We're not making pancakes. We should. We don't have pancake mix. We could pretend." He smiled. His daughter always had a solution. 6-year-old Noelle had inherited her mother's imagination. Sometimes Darius thought she'd inherited too much of her. He slowly sat up, rubbing the sleep from his face before looking toward the framed photograph sitting on the nightstand. A smiling woman. Curly hair, bright eyes. Hospital bracelet still visible around her wrist because she'd insisted on taking that picture after Noelle was born. Camille, his wife. Gone almost 2 years now. Some mornings still felt impossible. Other mornings, Noelle made impossible feel manageable. "Daddy? You're thinking about Mommy again." He looked over at her. "Was it obvious? You make that face." "What face?" "The sad one." She climbed onto his lap and wrapped both tiny arms around his neck. "You don't have to miss her by yourself." He closed his eyes. Children had a way of saying things adults spent years trying to figure out. "I know." After a long hug, Noelle suddenly gasped. "The bus." Darius looked at the clock. 7:18. "Oh no." They both jumped off the bed at the same time. For the next 20 minutes, their apartment transformed into beautiful chaos. One shoe disappeared. Toast popped up before burning. A lunchbox couldn't be found. Noelle insisted her stuffed elephant needed breakfast too. By 7:41, they were sprinting down the sidewalk together. The school bus was already pulling away. "Wait!" The driver smiled through the mirror and stopped. Noelle hugged her father tightly. "Love you. You more." "You always say that." "'Cause it's always true." She climbed aboard. Halfway down the aisle, she turned around. "Daddy, don't forget your interview." He gave her a thumbs up. "I won't." The doors closed. The bus disappeared around the corner. Only then did Darius allow himself to exhale. Today's interview mattered. More than any interview before it. 3 months earlier, the transportation company he'd worked for had closed after filing for bankruptcy. Every application since then had ended the same way. "We're looking for someone with executive driving experience." "We'll call you." Nobody ever called. His savings were gone. His unemployment checks had ended. Rent was already 2 weeks late. Electricity 5 days. He tried not to think about that. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and felt the folded letter still resting there. He unfolded it one more time. Not because he hadn't memorized it, because it reminded him why he refused to quit. Dear Dad, my teacher asked us who our hero is. Everybody else wrote about superheroes or famous people. I wrote about you. You always make breakfast even when you're tired. You never let me see you cry. You tell me Mommy is still cheering for us. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. Love, Noel. He smiled despite himself. The edges of the paper had become soft from being unfolded so many times. Whenever life became overwhelming, he read it again. Then he carefully folded it and slipped it back into his coat pocket. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Darius Cole speaking. Mr. Cole, yes. This is Elaine from Hawthorne Executive Services. His heart skipped. We've had a last-minute request from one of our VIP clients. He straightened immediately. I'm listening. One of Chicago's most prominent business executives needs a temporary personal chauffeur beginning today. Darius frowned. I thought the position was already filled. It was. A pause. Her driver suffered a medical emergency an hour ago. And you called me? You have an impeccable driving record, military defensive driving certification, and excellent references. Darius looked toward the grey Chicago skyline. I'll take it. Wonderful. Where do I report? North Harbor Tower. His eyebrows rose. The headquarters of Sterling International. One of the largest investment firms in America. Be there by 9. The call ended. Darius looked up at the cloudy sky. For the first time in months, hope felt real again. He had absolutely no idea that before sunset, one decision would place him directly in the path of one of the most powerful women in America. Darius checked the address twice before pulling into the underground entrance of North Harbor Tower. The 38-story glass building dominated the Chicago skyline like a monument to power. Black SUVs rolled in and out beneath discreet security cameras while men in tailored suits hurried through revolving doors with phones pressed to their ears. He suddenly became very aware of the frayed cuff on his coat. You belong here, he muttered to himself. Whether he believed it or not was another matter. A security officer approached his driver's window. Name, Darius Cole. The officer glanced at his tablet before nodding. Temporary chauffeur assignment. Yes, sir. Parking level B, elevator 3. Someone from Executive Services will meet you. Thank you. 5 minutes later, Darius stood inside a spotless executive lounge overlooking Lake Michigan. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, ferries drifted across the grey water while helicopters buzzed toward downtown. Mr. Cole, he turned. The woman approaching him looked to be in her early 40s, dressed in a navy pantsuit with silver-rimmed glasses. I'm Marlene Whitaker, Executive Operations. She extended her hand. Thank you for coming on such short notice. My pleasure. She studied him for a second. Military posture, calm eyes, firm handshake, professional. Exactly what she'd hoped for. Normally we don't hire temporary chauffeurs for this client. I understand. But today's circumstances are unusual. She handed him a leather folder. Before we continue, you need to sign a confidentiality agreement. Darius skimmed the first page. His eyebrows lifted. $5 million, the penalty for violating confidentiality. He gave a nervous chuckle. I don't own $5 million. Neither do most people who sign it. He smiled faintly before adding his signature. Marlene closed the folder. Good, she lowered her voice. Your client is Miss Celeste Ashcombe. Even if someone had never opened a business magazine, they knew the name. Founder and CEO of Ashcombe Capital, Forbes estimated her net worth somewhere north of $8 billion. She rarely gave interviews, rarely attended social events, rarely smiled in photographs. The financial press had nicknamed her the Ice Queen of Wall Street. Any questions? Marlene asked. Only one. Go ahead. Why does someone like Ms. Ashcombe need a temporary chauffeur instead of using security? A shadow crossed Marlene's face. She insists on doing certain things. Normally. Before Darius could ask what that meant, another woman hurried into the lounge. She's coming. Everyone immediately straightened. The room fell silent. Even the assistants stopped typing. The elevator doors slid open. Celeste Ashcombe stepped out. She wasn't surrounded by photographers. She wasn't wearing anything flashy. Just a charcoal grey coat over a black dress. her dark hair tied neatly behind her shoulders, yet somehow everyone instinctively moved out of her way. So she thanked the receptionist by name, how his wife was recovering after surgery, complimented someone's new glasses. It wasn't what Darius expected. For someone nicknamed the Ice Queen, she seemed surprisingly observant. Then she looked at him. Her expression changed. Not colder, more curious. "This is him?" Marlene nodded. "Temporary replacement." Darius up and down. "You served," he blinked. "How did you know? The way you stand." A brief pause. "Marines. Army." "Good." No smile, no introduction. She simply walked toward the elevator again. "Come." The black Mercedes Maybach glided effortlessly onto Lakeshore Drive. For the first 15 minutes, silence. Celeste sat in the rear seat reviewing documents on a tablet while Darius kept his attention on traffic. Finally, she spoke. "Children?" He glanced into the mirror. "One daughter, age 6. Another pause. "Sign. I have one too." That surprised him. The media never mentioned a child. "How old?" 7. "Does she go to private school?" "Unfortunately." Darius frowned. "Unfortunately. My daughter believes money solves every problem." There was no bitterness in her voice, only disappointment. "I've tried teaching her otherwise." Traffic slowed near Navy Pier. A homeless veteran stood beside the intersection holding a cardboard. Darius recognized the camouflage cap instantly. Without thinking, he reached into the center console where drivers often kept loose bills. Nothing. He checked his wallet. $34. That was everything he had until Friday. He hesitated, then rolled down his window at the red light. "Morning, brother." The veteran smiled. "Morning." Darius handed him $20. "You sure?" "Yeah. You've got a family." "I do." The veteran nodded respectfully. "I'll pay it forward." The light turned green. Darius drove on. He never noticed the woman watching him through the rearview mirror. Celeste quietly returned to her tablet, but she hadn't read a single word. At 11:30 they arrived at the Children's Discovery Museum on Navy Pier. Darius stepped out first to open the rear door. "Wait here, of course." He watched as Celeste disappeared inside the museum. About 20 minutes later, a tiny girl burst through the entrance laughing. Chestnut curls, yellow raincoat, bright red rain boots. She couldn't have been older than 7. She spotted Celeste immediately. "Mom!" The billionaire's entire face transformed. Gone was the composed executive. In her place stood just a mother. She knelt and hugged her daughter tightly. "You behaved. I only climbed one dinosaur." Celeste sighed dramatically. "Only one. It wasn't a real dinosaur. That's not the point." The little girl giggled. Then she noticed Darius standing beside the car. "Who's he?" "Our driver today." "I'm Elodie." "Darius." She looked around. "Where's your family? I have a daughter. What's her name? Noelle. Can she come play sometime?" Celeste interrupted gently. "Elodie. What? You've known him for 8 seconds. I know." The girl shrugged. "But he has kind eyes." Darius laughed. "So I've been told." Before anyone could say another word, a loud crash echoed across the parking lot. Everyone turned. A delivery motorcycle had slammed into the side of an SUV. The rider rolled across the pavement. People screamed. Without hesitation, Darius sprinted toward the accident. Celeste watched in stunned silence. By the time security reached the scene, the poor single father was already kneeling beside the injured rider, checking his pulse, stabilizing his neck, giving calm instructions to panicked bystanders. "You. Call 911. You. Don't move him, you. Bring me those jackets." Everything about him changed. His voice, his posture, his confidence. He looked like someone who had done this before. Celeste slowly walked closer. "Darius." He looked up briefly. "Tell them to send an ambulance to the east entrance." She immediately pulled out her phone. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. One medic knelt beside Darius before looking at him in surprise. "You military?" "Former Army." "I figured," the medic smiled. "You probably saved him from permanent spinal damage." As they loaded the injured man into the ambulance, Darius quietly stepped back. He wiped the blood from his hands with a paper towel someone offered him. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't wait for thanks. He simply turned toward the Maybach. "Ms. Ashcombe." "We should probably get going." Celeste stared at him for a long moment. Then she noticed something. While he'd been kneeling, his coat had opened slightly. The folded letter had slipped halfway out of his pocket. She didn't read it. Not yet. But for reasons she couldn't explain. She couldn't stop wondering why he carried the same worn piece of paper everywhere he went. That evening, Darius drove Celeste back to North Harbour Tower in near silence. She kept glancing at the rearview mirror, not at the road, at him. "Same time tomorrow?" she finally asked. Darius looked up, surprised. "I thought this was a one-day assignment." "It was," she hesitated. "Marlene will call you tonight." He nodded slowly. "I'll be ready." When she stepped out at the tower entrance, she paused at the door. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, for today." He didn't ask what she meant, the motorcycle rider or something else. He simply nodded. "Just doing my job." She almost smiled. Almost. That night, Darius sat at his kitchen table long after Noelle fell asleep. 3 envelopes sat in front of him. Rent, overdue, electric, final notice, Noelle's school supply fee, due Friday. He rubbed his eyes and did the math again. It didn't add up. It never added up. He folded all 3 and slid them into a drawer, underneath old photographs where Noelle would never look. She believed everything was fine. He intended to keep it that way. His phone buzzed. "Marlene. You're confirmed through the week, same rate. Miss Ashcombe requested you specifically." Relief hit him harder than he expected. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank whatever you did today." The call ended. Darius looked toward Noelle's door, cracked open the way she liked it. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe. The week that followed fell into a rhythm. 7 a.m. pickups, board meetings, museum runs with Elodie. Long silent drives that slowly stopped being silent. Celeste started asking questions that had nothing to do with traffic or schedules. What was the army like? "Do you miss it? Was your wife funny or serious?" Darius answered carefully at first. Then honestly, there was no romance in it. Not yet. Just 2 exhausted people talking like human beings for the first time in a long while. Elodie, meanwhile, had made her decision the moment she met him. "Can Darius come to dinner? Can Noelle come to my school? Can we invite them Saturday?" Every time Celeste gave the same answer. "He works for us, sweetheart. That's different." Different how? Should. Celeste never had a good answer for that. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to like this video. It genuinely helps more people find it. And here's a question for you. Darius accept help when it's offered? Or is he right to protect his pride even when his daughter is the one who pays for it? Let us know in the comments. Now, back to the story. Friday afternoon, Celeste's phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. Elodie's birthday party. Saturday, 2 p.m. She hadn't planned on inviting Darius. She hadn't needed to. Elodie had already asked him herself, the day before, while he waited by the car. "You're coming Saturday, right?" Darius had crouched down to her eye level. "I don't think that's really. Please, it's my birthday, you have to." He glanced toward Celeste, who was watching from a distance, arms crossed, unreadable. "We'll see," he told Elodie gently. That night, Noelle found him staring at his one good shirt, the collar slightly frayed. "Is that for the party? Might not go, Sweet Bean." "Why not?" He didn't have a real answer for that either. "Because," he said finally, "sometimes grown-ups worry about things that don't matter as much as they think they do." Noelle considered this with the seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage. "I think you should go." "Yeah?" "Elodie said you have kind eyes. People with kind eyes should go to birthday parties." He laughed despite himself, and despite everything else he went. "Saturday, 1:45 p.m. You okay?" Noelle asked, sensing it before he said anything. Elodie spotted them first. "Noelle!" She sprinted across the lawn and nearly tackled her into a hug, the 2 of them collapsing into giggles before either had said a single word. Darius smiled, watching them run off toward a bounce house shaped like a dragon. The Ashcombe estate sat along the north shore, all glass and stone and manicured hedges, the kind of house that looked more like a museum than a home. Darius parked his 10-year-old sedan at the end of a driveway lined with Range Rovers, Bentleys, and a matte black Mac Laren that probably cost more than his entire apartment building. Noelle pressed her face to the window. "Daddy, is this a hotel?" "No, Sweet Bean." "A castle? Close enough." He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. The shirt was clean, pressed, the only nice one he owned. The gift in Noel's lap, a small stuffed elephant wrapped in newspaper comics because he couldn't afford wrapping paper, suddenly felt very small. "Yeah, you're doing the face again." He laughed under his breath. "Come on, let's go make a friend." The party was already in full swing by the time they reached the backyard. A catering staff of at least a dozen moved between guests, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres. A 3-tier cake sat under a tent shaped like a castle turret. Somewhere, a live string quartet played something that sounded suspiciously like a Disney theme, rearranged for violin and cello. Then he noticed the parents, a cluster of them near the drink table, dressed in clothes that cost more than his monthly rent, watching him with the particular kind of curiosity reserved for something that didn't belong in the frame. One man, in a navy blazer, leaned toward another and murmured something. The other laughed quietly. Darius kept his chin up and walked toward the food table anyway. "You must be new staff," the man in the blazer said, not unkindly but not warmly either. "I'm a guest," Darius said. The man's eyebrows lifted. "Whose?" "Elodie's." A pause. A recalibration. "Interesting." Darius let it go. He'd survived worse than a raised eyebrow. But 20 minutes later, as he reached for a plate near the buffet, the same man appeared. Beside him again, this time with a drink in hand and considerably less patience. "Look," the man said, lowering his voice like he was doing Darius a favor, "the help usually eats. Near the service entrance. Just so you're not standing around here all afternoon." The words landed like a slap. A few nearby parents fell silent. Darius didn't raise his voice. He never did. "I'm not staff," he said evenly. "I'm a guest. My daughter's right over there." The man glanced toward Noel mid-cartwheel near the Dragon Bounce House, and something his expression didn't soften. "In, of course," he said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. That was when Celeste appeared. Nobody heard her approach. She simply arrived, the way she always seemed to, and the temperature of the conversation dropped 10 degrees. "Bradley," the man in the blazer turned, visibly startled. "Celeste, I heard exactly what you were just." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Darius and his daughter are my guests, today and every time I choose to invite them. If that's a problem for you, the exit is behind you, not him." Bradley opened his mouth, found nothing worth saying, and closed it again. "I meant no disrespect," he finally managed. "You did," Celeste said, "but I'll accept the correction." She turned to Darius, her expression softening instantly, the ice melting into something almost apologetic. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That shouldn't have happened." "You don't have to apologize for him." "No," she agreed, "but I wanted to anyway." For the first time since they'd met, Darius saw something in her eyes that wasn't calculation or exhaustion. It looked a lot like respect. By late afternoon, the party had settled into that lazy, sugar-crashed rhythm all children's parties eventually reach. Noel and Elodie sat cross-legged on the grass, deep in negotiations over stuffed animals, while Celeste and Darius stood a short distance away near the edge of the garden. "She likes you," Celeste said, watching Elodie. "She doesn't like many people. She told me I have kind eyes. She's very perceptive for 7. Darius smiled, then hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Why do you let her be around? This?" He gestured vaguely at the mansion, the caterers, the wealth soaked into every corner of the yard. "Doesn't it worry you? What she'll grow up believing matters." Celeste was quiet for a long moment. "Every single day," she admitted. "That's why days like today matter. Watching her laugh with a kid whose father is teaching her that money isn't what makes someone good." She looked at him directly. "You're doing something right with Noel. I'm just trying to keep us afloat. That's not nothing." Neither of them noticed the man watching from the terrace above, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand, his eyes fixed not on the party, but on the growing ease between his boss and her driver. Gideon Mercer had worked beside Celeste Ashcombe for 10 years. He had never once seen her let her guard down like this. He didn't like it. Not one bit. He set his glass down, pulled out his phone, and typed a single message to a number saved only as Private Investigations, Hargrove. "Find out everything about Darius Cole, today, if possible." Then he smiled at a passing guest, raised his drink in a toast, and slipped back inside as though nothing at all was wrong. By Monday morning, Hargrove had a full report sitting on Gideon's desk. He'd expected debt, maybe a lawsuit, a bad divorce, something he could use. Instead, what he found only made him more uneasy. Darius Cole had an honorable discharge, a spotless credit history despite his financial struggles, no criminal record of any kind, and reference letters from 3 different former employers that all used variations of the same word, trustworthy. There wasn't a single thread to pull. Gideon read through the file twice, jaw tightening with every clean page. A man with nothing to hide was, in his experience, far more dangerous than a man with something to lose. He had spent a decade carefully managing Celeste Ashcombe's trust, positioning himself as her most reliable advisor, her closest confidant on the board. He had not spent 10 years building that position just to watch some out-of-work chauffeur wander in and start dismantling it in a matter of days. He closed the folder and made a decision. If there was nothing to find, he would simply have to create something. That afternoon, Gideon used his executive credentials to access the building's older security archive, the one system still running on legacy software that predated the company's most recent cybersecurity overhaul. He knew exactly which files to alter and exactly how much time he had before the footage synced to the newer, harder-to-touch servers. By 6 o'clock, a small folder of confidential merger documents, the kind that could tank a stock price if leaked to the wrong reporter, had been quietly moved into a temporary access log tied to Darius's newly issued visitor badge. The timestamp read the previous Thursday, a day Darius had, in fact, been alone in the executive garage waiting for Celeste to finish a late meeting. Gideon studied his work for a long moment before closing the laptop. It wasn't perfect. But it didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be convincing enough for a nervous board and a distracted CEO to believe it before anyone thought to look closer. Wednesday morning began like any other. Darius picked Noelle a lunch of leftover pasta, walked her to the bus stop, and made it to North Harbour Tower with 10 minutes to spare the way he always did. He never made it past the lobby. 2 uniformed officers were waiting by the security desk when he stepped through the revolving doors, and for a brief, disoriented moment, he assumed they were there for someone else. Then one of them said his name, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath him. "Darius Cole, we need you to come with us." "What is this about?" "Corporate theft, unauthorized access to confidential files. We have a warrant." The words didn't fully register at first. He stood there, keys still in his hand, as the officers stepped closer and one of them reached for his wrist. It was only when the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut that the reality of it hit him all at once, sharp and suffocating. Across the lobby, Elodie had just arrived for a school pickup meeting with her mother, and she saw the whole thing happen. She saw Darius being led toward the doors in handcuffs, his head down, his expression somewhere between shock and quiet resignation. She didn't understand what theft meant, not really, but she understood enough to know that something terrible was happening to someone she'd decided, almost immediately, that she loved. Noelle wasn't there. Not yet. But she would hear about it soon enough, and nothing about the version she heard would be gentle. That evening, Darius sat across from Noelle at their small kitchen table, out on bail thanks to a public defender who'd taken pity on his case, trying to find the right words for a conversation no parent should ever have to have. Noelle had heard whispers at school. A classmate's older sibling had seen something on the local news. By the time she climbed into the car after the final bell, she already knew something was wrong, even if she didn't know what. "Daddy," she said finally, her voice smaller than he'd heard it in a long time, "did you do something bad?" He knelt down in front of her chair so they were at eye level, the way he always did when something mattered. "No," he said. "I didn't do anything wrong. But sometimes, even when people are innocent, other people believe the worst about them anyway. That's why we always tell the truth, even when it's hard, even when it feels like nobody's listening. The truth doesn't stop being true just because someone doesn't believe it yet." Noelle studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of doubt, and found none. "I believe you," she said simply. "That's all I need." He pulled her into a hug and held on a little longer than usual, grateful that at 6 years old, her faith in him hadn't yet learned how to waver. At North Harbour Tower, the mood was considerably less forgiving. By Thursday, the board had convened an emergency session, and the pressure on Celeste was immediate and unrelenting. Security footage, however manipulated, painted a damning picture. Confidential files, keycard, access, a timestamp that placed Darius alone in a restricted area with no clear explanation. The optics alone are a liability, one board member argued. Regardless of what actually happened, Ashcombe Capital cannot be seen employing someone under active criminal investigation, even in a temporary capacity. Celeste sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, jaw tight, every instinct in her screaming that something about this didn't add up. But instinct wasn't evidence, and evidence, however manufactured, was staring back at her from the screen. Gideon, seated 2 chairs down, wore an expression of careful, practiced concern. "I know this is difficult, Celeste. I know you've grown fond of him, but the board is right to be cautious here." She looked at him for a long moment, something flickering behind her eyes that she couldn't quite name yet. By the end of the meeting, she had no real choice left. Later that day, with a heaviness in her chest she hadn't expected, she made the call that ended Darius Cole's temporary employment at Ashcombe Capital. She didn't tell him it was because she believed he was guilty. She didn't fully know yet what she believed at all. Celeste didn't sleep that night. She lay awake replaying the board meeting over and over. The security footage, Gideon's careful concern, the timestamp that placed Darius somewhere he swore he'd never been. Something about the whole situation sat wrong in her chest, the way a chord sits wrong when one note is just slightly off. Impossible to name, but impossible to ignore. By morning, she'd made a decision that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. Gideon had access to resources most people never saw, private investigators, legal teams, connections that stretched further than she sometimes wanted to think about. If someone was determined to make an example of Darius Cole, staying in Chicago wasn't safe for him, whether he'd done anything wrong or not. She needed him gone before anyone decided a public accusation wasn't punishment enough. She had Marlene track down his address, a modest apartment complex on the south side, and she drove there herself instead of sending someone else, something she almost never did. Darius answered the door still in yesterday's clothes, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. Noel was at the kitchen table doing homework, and he stepped outside quickly, pulling the door mostly shut behind him, some instinct telling him this conversation wasn't meant for small ears. "Miss Ashcombe, Celeste, please." He studied her for a moment, wary, guarded in a way he hadn't been even during the worst of the interrogation. "What are you doing here?" She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She reached into her coat and pulled out a thick envelope, holding it out to him with a hand that wasn't quite steady. "Please," she said, "I'll pay you. $100,000. Just take it and go somewhere far from Chicago. Start over, please. Just take the money and walk away." Darius stared at the envelope, then at her, something hardening behind his eyes. "You think I did it?" "No," she said quickly. "That's not why I'm here." "Then why?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation he saw something close to fear. "Because the man who's doing this to you is dangerous, and I don't fully understand what he's capable of yet. I need you safe, and I need you far away from here while I figure out who's really responsible." "So you believe me?" "I don't know what I believe," she admitted, "but I know you don't deserve whatever is coming next, guilty or not, and I can't sit here and let that happen to you and your daughter without at least trying to stop it." Darius shook his head slowly, the same quiet refusal he'd given her once already, though she didn't know that yet, not really, not in the way she would soon. "I've spent my whole life teaching my daughter that innocent people don't run," he said. "I'm not about to teach her the opposite now, no matter how much money is in that envelope. Darius, please, you don't understand what you're up against. Maybe not. But I understand what kind of father I want to be, and that man isn't one who takes a payoff and disappears the moment things get hard." They stood there in the doorway, the argument circling back on itself, neither willing to yield, until Celeste, frustrated and desperate, reached out and grabbed his arm. "Just listen to me for 1 second. That was when it happened. In the small struggle, his coat shifted, and the folded letter, worn soft at the edges from being read 1,000 times, slipped free and fell to the ground between them. Celeste bent down before he could stop her and picked it up. She unfolded it without asking permission, some instinct pulling her hand before her mind had caught up, and she began to read. "Dear Dad, my teacher asked us who our hero is. Everybody else wrote about superheroes or famous people. I wrote about you." Her breath caught somewhere in her chest. "You always make breakfast even when you're tired. You never let me see you cry. You tell me Mommy is still cheering for us. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. Love, Noelle." By the time she reached the end, her eyes had filled, and she pressed the letter against her chest for a moment before looking back up at him, something in her expression completely undone. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh my God." Darius watched her, confused by the sudden shift, unaware that she was seeing him now, truly seeing him for the first time since they'd met. Not a suspect, not a liability, not a temporary chauffeur who happened to be good with an accident scene. Just a father who carried his daughter's love for him folded in his pocket like armor. The kind of man who couldn't possibly be capable of the betrayal everyone was so certain of. "A man raising his daughter like this," she said quietly, almost to herself, "could never do what they're saying you did." She handed the letter back to him carefully, as though it might tear from something as simple as her fingers. "I'm sorry," she said. "I misjudged this completely. I let the board scare me into believing something I never should have believed in the first place. So what happens now?" Celeste wiped her eyes quickly, composure returning, but something had shifted permanently behind them, a resolve that hadn't been there a few minutes earlier. "Now," she said, "I find out who actually did this, and I fix what I broke." She turned to leave, then paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back at him one last time. "Keep that letter close," she said. "I have a feeling it's about to matter more than either of us realizes." She was right, though neither of them yet understood exactly how. Celeste spent the next 2 days doing something she hadn't done in years, her own digging alone, without assistants or lawyers hovering at her elbow. She started with the security footage itself, pulling the raw files instead of the polished summary the board had been shown, and it didn't take long to notice what everyone else had missed. The timestamp overlay didn't quite match the file's internal metadata, a discrepancy of nearly 40 minutes that no legitimate recording should have had. From there, the inconsistencies multiplied quickly once she knew to look for them. The keycard log showed Darius badging into a restricted floor at a time he'd actually been sitting in the executive garage waiting on her, a fact confirmed by the garage's own separate camera system, one Gideon apparently hadn't thought to touch. The financial records tied to the supposedly stolen files had been quietly reorganized just days before the theft was reported, moved through a shell account that traced back, after several frustrating hours, to an authorization code belonging to exactly one person with the clearance to issue it. Gideon Mercer. She sat with that for a long time, staring at the screen, feeling something between fury and grief. 10 years of trust, 10 years of believing she had one person in that building who was truly on her side, undone in the space of a single afternoon. She didn't confront him immediately. Instead, she spent the following 2 days quietly building the case, cross-referencing every discrepancy, pulling bank records that showed years of small, careful transfers skimmed from vendor contracts, money that had been disappearing in amounts too small to trigger alarms but too consistent to be coincidence. By the time she finished, she had enough to bury him. The board reconvened Friday morning, called in for what Gideon believed was a routine vote to formalize his transition into the interim CEO role, while Celeste dealt with what he assumed was the fallout of the Cole scandal. He stood at the head of the table in a tailored charcoal suit, already rehearsing his acceptance remarks in his head, when the doors opened and Celeste walked in. She wasn't alone. 2 FBI agents followed a few steps behind her, along with Darius, who walked in with his head high, no longer the man who'd been dragged out of the lobby in handcuffs days earlier. His composure flickered just slightly before he recovered it. "Celeste, I wasn't aware we'd changed the agenda." "We have," she said, taking her seat at the head of the table without breaking eye contact with him. "We're going to talk about who actually accessed those confidential files." She projected the evidence onto the boardroom screen, one piece at a time. The mismatched timestamps, the garage footage, the shell account, the authorization code. The room fell into a silence so complete you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "This is absurd," Gideon said, his voice rising for the first time in 10 years of composed, careful meetings. "You're going to take the word of a chauffeur over 10 years of loyalty." "I'm taking the word of the evidence," Celeste said calmly, "which, unfortunately for you, doesn't lie the way people do." One of the agents stepped forward. "Gideon Mercer, we need you to come with us." For a moment it looked like he might argue, might try one last time to talk his way out of it the way he'd talked his way into rooms for a decade. But the fight drained out of him almost as quickly as it had risen, and he simply nodded, straightened his jacket, and walked out flanked by federal agents, while the board members who'd voted to fire Darius just days earlier sat in stunned, humiliated silence. Darius watched him go, feeling not triumph exactly, but something quieter. Relief, maybe. The simple, exhausted relief of a man who'd finally been believed. 3 weeks later, life had settled into something neither of them had expected. Celeste had personally overseen Darius's exoneration, made sure the charges were formally dropped and the record expunged, and when she offered him a position leading executive security for Ashcombe Capital, she made a point of telling him it wasn't charity. "You've got the training, the instincts, and apparently the ability to stay calm while a company implodes around you," she said. "That's not a favor. That's a job I need filled." He thought about it for exactly one night before accepting, and when he told Noelle she'd thrown her arms around his neck so hard he nearly lost his balance. "Does this mean we're not moving again?" she'd asked, and the hope in her voice had nearly broken him. "We're not moving again," he promised. On a bright Saturday afternoon in Millennium Park, Noelle and Elodie ran ahead toward the crowned fountain, shrieking with laughter every time the water shifted and sent them scattering. Darius and Celeste walked a short distance behind, no title between them now, no chauffeur, no CEO, just two people who'd been through something difficult together and come out the other side of it still standing. "So," Celeste said, watching the girls chase each other through the spray, "does this count as work? Technically, you're still watching over my daughter." Darius smiled, the easy kind of smile that had taken weeks to fully return to his face. "No," he said. "I think this counts as living." She glanced at him, something soft and unguarded in her expression, the same look Elodie had described on the very first day, the kind of look that came from someone who'd finally stopped bracing for disappointment. Without quite deciding to, she reached over and slipped her hand into his. He didn't let go. Above them, the girls' laughter carried across the park, mixing with the sound of the fountain and the distant hum of the city, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to look forward to. If this story moved you even a little, make sure to like this video. It genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this. Subscribe if you want more emotional journeys like Darius and Celeste's every week, and let us know in the comments what would you have done if you were in Celeste's shoes. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.